All right, so today we're diving into some pretty murky waters. Buddhism and Hinduism, those are usually seen as, religions of peace.
Yeah, that's the common perception for sure.
But we're going to explore how they've actually gotten tangled up with violence and hostility in Southeast Asia.
It's a side of these religions that most people don't really think about.
It's a real head scratcher, right?
Right.
Like, how can these peaceful traditions be used to justify violence?
It definitely challenges our assumptions.
So our mission today is to try to understand the complex factors that are driving these movements. How do they intertwine with politics, with ethnicity, with history?
Oh, a multi-layered problem, that's for sure.
We're going to try to unpack all of that layer by layer. So let's kick things off in Myanmar. This is where the Rohingya crisis unfolded, right? A tragic example of ethnic cleansing. And it's all fueled by this Buddhist nationalist ideology.
Yeah, and to understand that, we need to understand the 969 movement. It's a Buddhist nationalist group, and their whole rhetoric is basically painting this picture of a civilizational clash.
Buddhists versus Muslims, essentially.
Exactly. They see the Rohingya Muslim minority as a threat.
And then you have this guy, Ashin Wirathu. He's a Buddhist monk. And his speeches are just, wow, calling for boycotts of Muslim businesses, even comparing Muslims to dogs.
His rhetoric is incredibly inflammatory. It's
Yeah.
been condemned by, the international community.
It's scary how words can actually incite violence. Like, this isn't just abstract ideology. It has real-world consequences.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
The suffering of the Rohingya people is a direct result of this kind of hate speech.
It's a stark reminder of how quickly things can escalate. And, it's important to say that not all Buddhists in Myanmar support this. But the fact that it's happening under the banner of Buddhism, that's troubling.
It really highlights how powerful religious rhetoric can be, especially when religion and national identity are so intertwined.
Yeah, like this whole us versus them narrative can be incredibly potent.
It plays on people's fears and insecurities.
Okay, so we've seen this play out in Myanmar, but it's not an isolated case, right? I mean, Thailand's southern provinces are also seeing these tensions between Buddhists and Malay Muslims.
Right. There's this ongoing insurgency there. It's a complex situation with a long history.
But what's interesting is how some Buddhist nationalist groups are exploiting this conflict.
Yeah, they're framing it as this, battle to protect Buddhism from Islam.
So they're using this existing conflict to push their own agenda.
Exactly. They're leveraging this fear and anxiety to gain support. And ultimately, their goal is to, establish this more dominant Buddhist national identity. It's worth noting, though, that there are also plenty of Thai Buddhists who are advocating for peace and coexistence.
So it's not a monolithic thing.
Definitely not.
It seems like a common thread here is this idea of protecting the dominant religion, even if it means resorting to violence.
That's a key point.
And we see the same thing happening in Sri Lanka. The Bodu Bala Sena, the BBS, they're stirring up all this anti-Muslim sentiment. And Sri Lanka is a place with this long history of peaceful Buddhism.
It's a striking example of how, even in places where tolerance has been the norm, things can change.
It's like a wake-up call, right? This religious nationalism can take root anywhere.
And it highlights the fact that we can't just look at the general principles of a religion. We have to see how those principles are being interpreted and used in specific contexts.
Okay, so we've seen how this Buddhist nationalism has led to violence in these countries. Now, let's switch gears and look at Hinduism. It's generally associated with nonviolence, but in India, there's this ideology called Hindutva that's been gaining a lot of traction.
Yeah, Hindutva is basically a political ideology that seeks to define Indian national identity in Hindu terms.
So, India is fundamentally a Hindu nation, and Hindu culture should be at the forefront of society.
That's the basic idea.
And this Hindutva ideology has been linked to violence against religious minorities, particularly Muslims. Groups like the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, they've been promoting this ideology.
Yeah, the RSS especially has a long history of advocating for Hindu supremacy.
And the BJP's rise to power has definitely emboldened these sentiments.
For sure.
And we've seen some really disturbing instances of violence tied to this ideology, like the 2002 Gujarat riots. That was horrifying.
Absolutely. Over 1,000 people were killed, mostly Muslims. It was a brutal pogrom.
It's hard to directly link the violence to specific groups, but it happened in this climate of heightened Hindu nationalism.
Yeah, the atmosphere was ripe for that kind of violence.
And it's not like that was a one-off incident. The Muzaffarnagar riots in 2013 also targeted Muslims, and there have been so many other instances of violence and discrimination. It's a pattern.
It's a worrying trend.
Yeah.
And the 2019 Citizenship Amendment Act, the CAA, also reflects this kind of thinking. It offered a fast track to citizenship for non-Muslim refugees from neighboring countries.
Which a lot of people saw as discriminatory against Muslims.
Exactly.
And it sparked these huge protests, some of which turned violent. So it's clear that these tensions are still very much alive.
For sure.
So while Hindutva claims to be about preserving Hindu culture, it seems like it's often used to justify excluding and even harming those who don't fit their definition of what it means to be Indian.
That's a key point. It's about power. And often that power comes at the expense of minorities. And what's really concerning is this rhetoric around the reconquest of historically Muslim-ruled regions.
Like, we've seen people calling for the destruction of mosques and building Hindu temples in their place.
Yeah.
That's chilling. It echoes what we hear from religious extremists all over the world.
The parallels are definitely there.
Okay, so we've covered Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and India. Buddhist nationalism and Hindu nationalism on the rise. But what about other parts of Southeast Asia, where Hinduism is also a significant religion?
Let's look at Indonesia, for example.
Yeah.
Hinduism, there isn't linked to widespread violence like in India. But you do have these localized tensions between Hindus and Muslims, especially in certain regions.
So how does this fit into the picture of, like, religious nationalism?
Well, it's complicated. But in some areas, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism has triggered this kind of like reactive Hindu identity politics.
So Hindus are feeling threatened and responding by emphasizing their own Hindu identity, almost like a defensive measure. It's like one form of religious extremism is fueling another, even if the original expression of Hinduism wasn't focused on violence.
Exactly. These dynamics are always shifting, and they influence each other.
And what about Malaysia? They have a sizable Hindu population, too.
They do, and there have been incidents of Hindu temples being vandalized.
Is that tied to this push for a more Malay Muslim national identity?
It's often seen that way. And it's created this feeling of exclusion among many Hindus. Groups like Hindruf, the Hindu Rights Action Force, are fighting for the rights of ethnic Indians, many of whom are Hindu, because they're facing discrimination.
So all across Southeast Asia, religion is getting more and more tangled up with politics and identity. But why now? Why are these movements gaining traction at this particular moment in time?
Well, if we look at the bigger picture, we see that these movements often pop up during times of political instability, or when national or religious identities feel threatened.
So when people are feeling insecure or anxious about the future, they're more likely to grab onto these ideologies that offer simple explanations and scapegoats.
Exactly. And we've seen this throughout history. Economic crises, political corruption, regional conflicts, all of those things can create this breeding ground for fear and instability.
People are looking for someone to blame, someone to make sense of the chaos.
And often, it's minorities who end up being targeted.
It's a classic us versus them narrative.
And it can be very effective at rallying support.
These movements are clever, too. They frame their actions as defensive, like they're just protecting their culture or their religion from these outside forces.
It's a key part of their strategy. They tap into this sense of a world that's changing too fast, a sense of loss, of fear.
They offer a kind of security and belonging in a world that feels very uncertain.
Exactly. And that can be very appealing to people who feel like they've been left behind, like they're losing control.
Okay, so we've laid out the general trends and we've talked about some of the underlying factors. But let's get down to brass tacks here. How are these movements actually exploiting people's fear and insecurity to gain support? Let's get into some concrete examples.
Okay, let's go back to Myanmar and the Rohingya crisis.
Okay.
Remember, Myanmar has a long history of political and economic turmoil.
The military junta, human rights abuses.
Right. And even though there's been a transition to a more democratic system, there's still a lot of instability and uncertainty.
The economy is struggling, there are ethnic conflicts, it feels like the country is at a crossroads.
And into this climate of uncertainty comes the 969 movement. And they offer this very simple explanation for all of the country's problems. The Rohingya Muslims.
They're the scapegoat.
Exactly. They're portrayed as illegal immigrants, stealing jobs, stealing resources, a threat to Buddhist culture, a threat to national security.
It's classic fear-mongering.
And it works. It's incredibly effective at mobilizing support for the movement, even though it's based on prejudice and misinformation.
And we see the same tactic being used in Thailand, especially in the southern provinces where the insurgency is happening.
Absolutely. Those provinces have a history of separatist movements and violence, and the majority of the population there is Muslim.
So it's like a perfect storm for the Buddhist nationalist groups to exploit.
Right. They're pushing this idea that Muslims are inherently a threat to Thai national unity and to Buddhist culture.
They're using the insurgency to justify their own agenda, which further marginalizes the Muslim population.
It's a vicious cycle. They tap into the fear and anxiety caused by the insurgency and twist it to fit their narrative. And it resonates with some people, especially those who are already feeling threatened by the perceived rise of Islam in the region.
So the pattern is clear. These movements are masters at exploiting real-world problems and anxieties. But what about the international community? What are they doing about all of this?
Well, there's been a lot of condemnation from the UN, from human rights groups. They're urging governments to protect minority rights, promote religious freedom, address the root causes of extremism.
But it's a tough situation, right? I mean, the international community doesn't want to interfere in the internal affairs of sovereign nations, but they can't just stand by and watch as minorities are persecuted.
It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And some governments in Southeast Asia are very resistant to outside intervention.
They see it as interference in their internal affairs. Like, thanks, but no thanks, we'll handle this ourselves.
Exactly.
Even if their handling of the situation is part of the problem.
It can be incredibly frustrating for those who are trying to advocate for human rights. It's this constant tension between national sovereignty and international responsibility.
It sounds like there are no easy answers here.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's a complex problem with so many layers, so many competing interests.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. Buddhist and Hindu nationalism on the rise in Southeast Asia. And we've seen how these movements are intertwined with politics, with ethnicity, with history.
And we've seen how they exploit religious sentiments to achieve political goals, often using fear, insecurity, and scapegoating to gain support.
It's a sobering picture, but it's important to understand these complexities if we want to find solutions.
Absolutely. We need to grasp the problem before we can even begin to address it. It's a tough spot for the international community, isn't it?
It really is. Last time we were talking about how they're dealing with all this religious nationalism in Southeast Asia. On the one hand, you've got these like strong calls for human rights, protecting minorities, all that.
Yeah, a lot of pressure to intervene.
But then some of these governments are pushing back, saying, hey, this is our business, you stay out of it, asserting their sovereignty and all that.
It's a clash of priorities, for sure.
It makes you wonder if they're worried about setting a precedent, Like, if they step in for this, then suddenly it's open season for intervention anywhere.
That slippery slope argument comes up a lot.
And let's be real, sometimes governments use that national sovereignty line just to avoid being held accountable, Well, they keep on doing discriminatory stuff.
It's a convenient shield sometimes.
So it's not always genuine. So given all this tension, what can the international community actually do? What tools do they have that might actually be effective?
Well, the first steps are usually diplomacy and dialogue, right? Working behind the scenes, putting on the pressure, encouraging these governments to, uphold human rights standards.
But we've seen that doesn't always work. Some governments just aren't going to listen no matter how much you try to persuade them.
Unfortunately, that's true.
So then what?
Then you start looking at tougher options. Things like economic sanctions. Or in really extreme cases, even military intervention. But those are last resorts.
And they come with a whole host of problems themselves, right? I mean, using force, that can totally backfire. You end up creating more resentment, fueling anti-Western sentiment. You might actually strengthen the nationalist movements because now they can play the victim.
Exactly. It feeds right into their narrative.
So it's a mess. Even the potential solutions are full of problems.
It's a real dilemma.
But there's got to be some approaches that are at least promising, right? I mean, come on.
There are some things that have shown some potential. One that comes up a lot is supporting local organizations, like civil society groups, that are working within these countries. They're doing great work, promoting interfaith dialogue, fostering understanding at the grassroots level.
That seems like a smart move, right? If the government's part of the problem, go around them. Empower the people who are actually trying to build bridges.
That's the idea. And these local groups, They often have more credibility within their communities, you know? They've got the trust that international organizations might not have.
They can operate under the radar, be more effective.
Right. It's a more subtle approach.
So it's like a quiet revolution, changing hearts and minds from the bottom up.
I like that. A quiet revolution. And it's not just theoretical. There are groups out there already doing this stuff,
Yeah.
bringing people from different faiths together, breaking down stereotypes, building relationships, creating these personal connections that can really chip away at that prejudice.
Okay, so that's one promising approach. Let's shift gears a bit now. We've talked about the challenges of responding to these movements, but what about the consequences of not responding? What happens if we just sit back and do nothing? How do these movements actually hurt people?
Well, the most obvious and tragic consequence is violence.
Yeah, we've talked about the Rohingya.
Right. But there are countless other examples. Religious minorities are facing violence and persecution all across the region.
It's hard to imagine, people being targeted just for their faith. What kinds of violence are we talking about specifically?
It runs the gamut, really.
Yeah.
Physical attacks, property destruction, threats, intimidation, social exclusion. It creates this climate of fear where people are afraid to practice their faith openly, you know?
So they're stripped of their religious freedom, which is a basic human right.
Exactly.
And I imagine that this atmosphere, this fear and distrust, it's got to have a broader impact on society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. It impacts social cohesion, political stability. When you've got groups actively promoting intolerance and division, it just polarizes society.
Yeah.
Leads to fragmentation and conflict,
Like a wedge being driven between communities that used to coexist.
and it makes it that much harder to solve other problems, you know?
Yeah.
The problems that need everyone to work together.
Right, like poverty, inequality, the environment, all those things need collective action.
Exactly. But when people are so caught up in fear and suspicion of the other, it's impossible to find common ground.
And what about democracy? These movements, they seem fundamentally opposed to, like, the values of pluralism and inclusivity.
They are. Democracy thrives on tolerance, on respect for diversity. When you have groups that are trying to exclude and marginalize others, it undermines the whole system.
So it's not just about individual acts of violence, it's about damaging the fabric of society itself.
It's a multifaceted problem with far-reaching implications. It affects individual safety, freedom of religion, social cohesion, political stability, even economic development.
Okay, so we've laid out how bad the consequences are, but is there any hope? Is there any way to reverse this trend?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And as we've discussed, there are no easy answers. But I do believe there are things we can do to counter this trend, to promote a more tolerant and inclusive society.
Okay, so let's hear it. What are some promising approaches that might actually make a difference?
Well, as we talked about earlier, supporting those grassroots organizations, the ones doing that interfaith dialogue and understanding work, that's critical. They're on the front lines, countering those narratives of hate and division.
They're out there doing the hard work, building those relationships.
They're the peacemakers, trying to mend that torn fabric of society.
It feels like such a small effort compared to the scale of the problem,
I hear that. But sometimes those small efforts, those localized efforts, they can have a ripple effect.
Okay, so we've got the grassroots organizing. What else?
Education. We need to be teaching kids about different religions and cultures, helping them develop empathy, respect, critical thinking skills.
Helping them see the world through different lenses, understand that diversity is a good thing.
Exactly. And it's not just about facts and figures, it's about instilling those values. Tolerance, compassion, respect for human dignity.
Raising a generation that's not afraid of difference, that celebrates it.
Right. And it's not just kids who need this education. Adults need it too. We all have biases. We all have preconceived notions that we need to challenge.
So we need more opportunities for interfaith dialogue in our communities. Workshops, events, even just informal gatherings where people can connect and learn from each other.
It's about fostering a culture of curiosity and openness, breaking down those barriers that keep us isolated.
All right, so grassroots organizing, education, what else can we do to tackle this issue?
We can't ignore the social and economic factors that contribute to intolerance. Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, those things create fertile ground for resentment and frustration. And that makes people more vulnerable to these messages of hate and division.
Like they're preying on people's vulnerabilities, offering scapegoats and simple solutions to complex problems.
That's exactly it. So
Yeah.
if we really want to get to the root of the problem, we have to address those bigger societal issues.
So it's not enough to just focus on dialogue and education. We need to create a more just and equitable society.
We have to attack the problem from all angles.
This all sounds great in theory, but what can individuals do? I mean, besides supporting those organizations, educating ourselves, what can we do in our everyday lives to promote tolerance and understanding?
Sometimes the simplest actions are the most powerful. It starts with challenging our own biases. Are we really open to learning from people who are different from us? Are we willing to step outside our comfort zones?
Actively seeking out those different perspectives.
And it's about speaking out against intolerance when we see it. Silence is often interpreted as agreement. We have to find the courage to speak up, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Being an active participant, not a passive observer, but sometimes it feels like those small actions, what difference can they really make? The problem is so huge.
I know that feeling. But remember, change starts with each of us. Every act of kindness, every conversation that bridges a divide, every time we choose empathy over fear, those things matter.
It's about chipping away at those walls of intolerance, brick by brick.
And it's crucial to hold on to hope. It's easy to get discouraged, but we have to believe that change is possible.
Hope is essential. We have to believe that we can make a difference, even if it's a small one.
We're all in this together.
Welcome back. It's been pretty heavy stuff, hasn't it?
It has.
This whole rise of, these violent Buddhist and Hindu movements, we've seen the political manipulation, the exploitation, the impact on minorities.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah. But remember last time we ended on a note of hope, we were talking about how even amidst all this darkness, there are people out there, organizations that are, working to build bridges, promote understanding between religions.
They're out there doing the hard work.
So for this last part, we want to shine a light on some of those inspiring stories, kind of like an antidote to all the negativity we've been talking about.
A good way to put it.
So where do we start?
Let's start with an organization in Sri Lanka called the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement.
Sri Lanka, huh? That's where we saw the BBS, right? Those Buddhist nationalists.
Yeah. Right. But Sarvodaya, they're kind of a counterforce to that. They've been around for decades, quietly promoting this vision of community development that's rooted in Buddhist principles.
So nonviolence, self-reliance, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But they don't just talk about it, they actually put it into practice. And a big part of their work involves bringing together people from all different faiths to work on community projects.
Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, all working side by side.
Right. It's like they're saying, let's forget about the labels for a minute. We're all neighbors here. We all want to make our community better.
It's a powerful message.
And it works. Through these shared experiences, people start to see each other as individuals, not just representatives of a religion.
It breaks down those stereotypes.
And Sarvodaya has been really effective in promoting reconciliation and peace building, especially in places that have been hit hard by conflict. They're living proof that positive change is possible.
It gives me hope hearing about stuff like that. What other stories do you have for us?
Let's go to Malaysia. Remember, Hindref? The group advocating for Hindu rights?
Yeah.
They're doing some really interesting interfaith work.
So even though they're focused on Hindu rights, they're not, shutting other religions out.
Not at all. They understand that to secure rights for one group, you need to create a culture of respect for everyone.
Makes sense. How does that actually play out?
Well, they've organized interfaith conferences, workshops, bringing religious leaders together, people from different communities, to talk about issues they all care about.
Finding common ground.
Exactly. They're also working to promote understanding of Hinduism among non-Hindus. They do open houses at temples, cultural events, educational programs.
So kind of demystifying the religion, making it less scary, less foreign.
Right. Humanizing the other. That's how you build a more harmonious society.
These stories are great. I'm already feeling a bit lighter. Any other examples of this kind of bridge building?
Yeah, there's a Buddhist monk in Thailand, Ajahn Brahmavamso.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of him. He's the Australian guy who became a monk, right?
That's him. He's really popular, and a big part of his message is about interfaith understanding and cooperation.
How does he go about that?
He's big on dialogue. He's always meeting with religious leaders from other faiths, imams, priests, even atheists, just to talk, to listen, to find common ground.
That's pretty brave. I mean, he's coming from a tradition that's often seen as pretty strict, you know?
It's definitely going against the grain.
Yeah.
But he believes that the only way to break down prejudice is to engage with people who are different from you.
Walk the walk.
And he's also really outspoken about religious freedom, about tolerance, always speaking out against discrimination. And he's got a great sense of humor, which I think makes him more relatable.
Yeah, humor can be disarming. Opens people up.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, one last example, and this one's a bit different. It's not an organization or a person, it's more of a concept. The global ethic.
The global ethic. What's that?
So back in 1993, a bunch of religious leaders from all over the world got together, and their goal was to figure out what ethical principles are shared by all the major religions.
Like the common ground of ethical behavior.
Exactly. And they came up with this document outlining the global ethic. Things like the golden rule, nonviolence, respect for life, justice, solidarity, honesty.
So even with all the differences, there's this underlying set of values that unite us.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And while the global ethic hasn't solved everything, it's a reminder that we're not as different as we think we are.
It's a powerful message. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the main thing you want our listeners to take away?
I hope they come away feeling hopeful, that even with all this religious nationalism and intolerance, there are reasons to be optimistic. There are people out there fighting for a better world, a world where understanding and respect and peace are the norm.
It's an uphill battle, but they're out there doing the work.
And we can all play a part, supporting those organizations, challenging our own biases, speaking out against injustice.
So listener, how are you feeling? A bit more hopeful, maybe even inspired to take action.
We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this complex issue.
We've seen how religion can be twisted and used to hurt people, but we've also seen its power to unite us, to heal us, to inspire us.
The choice is ours.
Small acts of kindness and understanding, those can make a difference.
They really can.
Be the change you want to see. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.